The doorbell rang just as they were completing their dinner. Anna, 12, got up to answer the door before her father or brother could get up, but she swiftly returned to the dining room with a puzzled frown. "It's a police officer, Daddy. He wants to talk to you." She notified him. Frank was terrified, but he tried his best to disguise it from his children when he came to the door. He realized the caller was actually a Georgia state trooper. "Are you the real Frank Parker?" the cop inquired. Frank confirmed. "Are you the husband of Meredith Parker?" When Frank nodded, the officer looked at the two children and asked, "May I speak with you in private, Mr. Parker?" Frank felt his throat tighten and had to clear it before speaking. "Daniel, Anna, please proceed to your rooms. I need to talk to the officer alone." Both youngsters began to argue, but when their father barked at them, they got up in a hurry to comply. They were not used to hearing this tone of voice. After the children had left the room, the officer returned to their father. "Mr. Parker, I've been requested to bring you some awful news. Your wife's plane has gone missing and is believed to have been shot down. It vanished from radar tonight, around midway between Miami International Airport and Nassau. A Coast Guard ship is currently searching for survivors. The information was basic enough. Meredith, as vice president of regional sales for a huge multinational organization, traveled to the Bahamas with the region's CFO to see the company's Caribbean headquarters. She was an accomplished small plane pilot, so the 180-mile flight to Nassau should have been simple. Frank hadn't given it much thought when Meredith called to tell him of her plans. He was distraught now. It was his biggest nightmare. His wife's plane had crashed overnight in shark-infested waters in the Caribbean. The officer provided a few other details that were unsettling to Frank, and he promised that the Coast Guard would call in the morning or sooner if there was any fresh information. Daniel and Anna approached him with concern on their faces, asking questions that their father couldn't answer. Frank knew they were listening in. If he were in their shoes, he would also be eavesdropping. The three of them huddled around, each attempting to find encouraging things to say to the others. Anna started crying, and Daniel's eyes turned crimson as well, despite his best efforts to remain brave. Frank was doing his best to maintain his composure for the sake of his children. But on the inside, he was absolutely enraged. Doing the dishes or homework was not an option. They kept their distance from each other for the remainder of the evening. It was past the regular bedtime for the children, yet there had been no phone call. Finally, fatigued by the late hour and their anxieties, all three of them entered the bedroom, where the children fell asleep with their father for the first time since they were tiny and terrified of thunderstorms. The next morning, they were already awake and about to eat breakfast when a Coast Guard representative called. The slight hope sparked by the call was swiftly dashed when the officer informed Frank that the boat patrolling the area had found nothing. Frank called the middle school principal. The children arrived and explained why Daniel and Lori would be absent that day. He went to check on them, only to find them watching a CNN report about the missing airliner. Frank wasn't sure whether he should let them continue watching or switch off the TV, but as soon as he made up his mind, the phone rang again. And from that point forward, as soon as Frank hung up after one call, another came in. Not surprisingly, Meredith's parents and his own were the first to call. They were all quite concerned, but they were also attempting to project a false sense of hope that she would be found magically. Frank promised to call back right away with any updates. Meredith's friends and co-workers called next. Everyone wanted to say or do something to help, but none knew how. The chats were short and unpleasant. The calls from the media were the most tough. He should have anticipated them. However, Frank was taken off guard when the first reporter contacted, and he spoke with the Journal-Constitution reporter for far longer than he planned to. Then other media began calling, and Frank recognized what was going on, so he began filtering all calls and only answering those from people he cared about. Throughout this activity, a procession of neighbors and friends began to arrive at their doors, each bearing condolences and refreshments. Frank lacked the energy to cook, so their generosity was first welcomed. However, he and his children soon had more food than they could possibly eat in 1 week. It was an old Southern habit to use food to communicate concern and condolences. While Frank appreciated the gesture, each roast and dish served as a sad reminder that his wife, whom he had lived with for 20 years, was probably certainly dead. The following several days were abysmal. The Parkers were essentially prisoners in their own home, held together by a desire not to interact with other people and the chance of receiving news from the Coast Guard. Frank contacted the Miami office daily for the most recent news, but the reports were invariably dismal. And 5 days after a state trooper arrived on their doorstep, they received the news they had been dreading. A Coast Guard officer called to advise Frank that the wreckage of his wife's jet had been discovered. There was no trace of any survivors. "I apologize, sir," the officer stated. "However, at this point, we must cease search and rescue efforts." Frank wanted only one thing: to hide and mourn alone. There was no such opportunity. Instead, he was burdened with an infinite list of tasks, all of which were excruciating. The saddest aspect, of course, was conveying the bad news to Daniel and Lori and trying to console them once they calmed down. He had to call family and close friends to inform them. Then he contacted their church to plan a memorial ceremony. Then the newspaper would write an obituary. More calls followed, informing them of the service's time and date. Frank was physically and emotionally weary at the end of the task. The family made it through the service and began the tedious, agonizing process of readjusting to normal life. The children returned to school the next week, and restarting a routine appeared to help a little. Frank wasn't as fortunate. He now faced a whole new set of obligations. Frank sought legal counsel at the suggestion of a friend. He was surprised to find that he would need to apply for a death certificate. However, her airplane crashed at sea. He complained. "How is there any doubt?" "I know," the attorney moaned. However, in the absence of a body and a doctor's report, the court must issue an official statement. "Do I have to wait 7 years?" Frank inquired, frustrated. "No," his lawyer reassured him. "In circumstances like these where a person has gone missing at sea, there are often no substantial delays following the World Trade Center assault. Death certificates were provided within a matter of days. However, several bodies were never recognized. You may have to answer some questions, but these situations are normally addressed fast. I can create a petition for you," the attorney said. "I can also assist you in amending all of the other paperwork." When Frank looked perplexed, the lawyer explained, "Well, you know, like joint bank accounts, mortgages, insurance, car titles, wills, anything. While I'm at it, you should contact your wife's employer to discover out what benefits you are entitled to and retrieve all of your personal possessions." Frank shook his head, exhausted from his anguish. He couldn't stop thinking about how tough it would be to undo the life he and his wife had created. He had one more task to complete, which he dreaded: calling the widow of John Collier, the CFO who was on the plane with Meredith. Frank had only met Collier a few times at his wife's company gatherings, but he loathed the guy right away. In the few time Frank spent with Collier, he was one of those narcissistic individuals who believe they are wiser than everyone else. Collier had managed to rattle off enough names and boast about his exploits to leave Frank with a foul taste in his mouth. But that wasn't his widow's fault. Frank reminded himself, and he felt compelled to confront her. Frank called ahead, and Amanda Collier was there waiting for him while they shared condolences. Frank recognized she was perhaps the only person who fully understood how he felt. As they seated in her parlor, she inquired kindly, "How are you doing right now, Frank?" "It's difficult, Amanda, really difficult. I just can't believe she's actually gone. There are so many things that remind me of her." He shook his head desperately. "Do you know what the most difficult thing is? When I'm on the street or in a throng, I keep thinking that I saw her the other day. I must have scared a poor woman to death. I caught up with her because I assumed she was Meredith." He stared down at the floor, recalling the memories and emotions he experienced as he recognized what he was doing. Amanda stared at him with sympathy. She understood that no words could help. He finally looked up at her. "And Amanda, how are you doing?" "It's not easy, Frank, but I'll handle it," she said. "The truth is that I'm probably doing much better than you are. I'm not required to have children because John and I did not, to give them comfort. That is how you do it. Besides, and I would not tell anyone else. Prior to this, John and I did not get along very well. I've caught him having a couple affairs in the past, and I believe he was in the midst of another one. If that hadn't happened, we'd probably have divorced a long time ago." "I'm sad to hear this, Amanda," Frank responded compassionately. "I can only image how conflicted you are feeling." She agreed, just for a moment. I'm glad I don't have to deal with his cheating anymore. Then I feel bad because I'm not feeling any sadder, and regardless of what, some parts of me still miss him. Are you going to be financially stable? Frank inquired, hoping to shift the conversation. I'm not sure, she said. The good news is that the company insured Frank's life, and because he died on a business trip, I will receive double the face value under the double indemnity clause. The bad news is that I'll need every cent of that money because I discovered that Frank made a series of disastrous trades in the futures market, depleting our holdings significantly. Frank was not surprised by Amanda's comments regarding her late husband. He couldn't imagine that a selfish man like John Collier could not be a devoted husband. Furthermore, the notion that Collier thought himself a market trader was completely consistent with Frank's perception of the man. Frank was lured to Amanda's mention of company-paid life insurance. He remembered his attorney's instructions and made a mental note to contact Meredith's benefits department right away. If Collier was covered, Meredith should have life insurance as well, and the monies could come in handy until he finds work. Frank rose from the couch after a few minutes of conversing. Amanda, please forgive me, but I have to cut my stay short. Billy and Lori will be out of school shortly, and I need to take them both up. But please remain in touch, and if there's anything I can do to assist, even if you just need a sympathetic ear, please don't hesitate to contact me. When Frank arrived to their residence after picking up Daniel and Lori, he was astonished to see an automobile parked in front of him. Frank took the kids into the house through the garage, and a minute later, the doorbell rang. Outside stood a man in his 50s and a young woman dressed for business. I'm Special Agent Harold Barnes. The man introduced himself as Special Agent Celia Murray. We're with the Georgia Bureau of Investigations. We'd want to stop by and ask you some questions about your wife's disappearance. Anna put her arms around her father's waist and buried her face in his side after realizing the two men were police officers. Frank felt her tears on his shirt and cradled her against him. What exactly does that mean? He demanded furiously. Before the first agent could respond, Agent Murray stepped in. Mr. Parker, I sincerely apologize for upsetting your daughter. All we're trying to do is perform a standard check in connection with your request for Mrs. Parker's death certificate. If you want us to return later, we will strive to do so at your convenience. Frank dismissed her and turned to face his daughter. It's all right, sweetheart. Nothing awful has happened. The female agent dropped to one knee, reached into her purse, took out a napkin, and extended it to the girl. Here, honey, she whispered softly. Lori paused and timidly accepted. She blew her nose after wiping her eyes with the tissue. When Frank noticed that his daughter had calmed down, he wrapped his arm around her and spoke to her. These individuals need to tell me a little bit about Lori, your mother. Why don't you go ahead and start completing your homework? If you need me, I'll be here in the living room. With those comments, he gently nudged the 12-year-old girl towards her room. He turned to face the cops. If it doesn't take too long, let us try to finish it. The three of them entered the living room and took seats around the coffee table. Mr. Parker, we need a little information on your wife, the male agent began. How long had you been married? We married in 1990. Frank answered shortly after graduating from the University of Georgia, recalling the lovely brunette he had won over so many years before. She also worked for the International Marketing Corporation for a long time before going missing. That is right. Frank verified that she was the vice president of sales for the southeastern U.S. Why would she travel to the Bahamas if she lives in the southeast? Frank describes what a younger woman asked at EMC. The Southeast encompassed both Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, as well as the United States. Mary had to frequently fly to Nassau, where their Caribbean headquarters were located. Mary? A woman inquired. Frank felt his voice become hoarser. My pet name for her was Mary. Agent Murray leaned out and compassionately patted him on the shoulder. It's all good, Mr. Parker. I understand how difficult this situation is for you. The senior agent decided to shift the course of questioning. Was it usual for your wife to use her own plane on business trips? Yes, Frank said. Mary's father was a pilot, and she obtained her license as soon as she was old enough. She took advantage of every opportunity to fly alone, claiming that it allowed her to be independent of commercial airline timetables. She claimed she could get where she needed to go, perform her business, and return home while her competitors remained stranded in the terminal. She believed that provided her an advantage, particularly when she was just starting out. Both agents made notes. Agent Mary then looked up at him. "So what about you, Mr. Parker? What do you do?" Frank smiled. "I am a house husband." Noticing their reactions, he went on, "I was an aerospace engineer until 3 years ago when my company downsized and I was laid off. Moving out of state was my only option for obtaining a new work, but in the meantime, Mary's work was going well. She had received many major promotions and was earning a high salary with large incentives. It made no sense for her to quit. So we decided that I would run the household and care for the kids while she worked." "How has this changed your relationship with Mrs. Parker?" Agent Barnes inquired. "What does that have to do with it?" Frank asked angrily. "Mr. Parker, please bear with us." The younger woman stepped in. "We need to determine if any factors contributed to your wife's disappearance. This is standard process." Frank relaxed a little and stared at both of them. "Yes, that was a major change for me, but I'm an engineer. I'm trained to measure and assess all design parameters. It was clear that my change in employment was the best thing for our family at the time. I let Mary focus on his job while ensuring Daniel and Anna were always close to their parents." Neither agent said anything, and Frank saw that the question hung in the air like that. "I don't mean to claim it was simple," he added. "She was usually calling clients or attending meetings at the corporation, so I didn't get to see her as much as I wanted. Sometimes it seemed like her work came first," and he realized what he was saying and added quickly, "However, this is rather normal in corporate life. Besides, things are going great." He realized that things had been going nicely thus far. "Two more questions, Mr. Parker," Agent Barnes stated. "Did you observe any changes in your wife's conduct before she went missing?" "Not really," Frank said after a moment of reflection. "I know she's been under a lot of strain over the past year or so, and her travel schedule has been busier than ever." Mary, on the other hand, stated that when she received her promotion, she was expecting it. She promised that the new work would reduce her travel while also providing a high-ranking position and a significant pay boost. "One last question." Agent Barnes spoke, taking notes in his notepad. "Are you aware of any financial changes that your wife has made in the last few months?" "No," Frank said confidently. "I keep track of all of our finances and have not noticed anything unusual." The young woman cast a peek at her spouse. "Mr. Parker, I suppose we've used up enough of your time. We'll be able to complete this quite fast and we'll notify you as soon as we do. In the meantime, if you think of anything you believe we should know, please phone me at this number." After that, she handed him her business card, and the two agents made their way to the door. Frank returned to his children's bedrooms to ensure they had finished their schoolwork. When he looked into their rooms, both appeared to be quite occupied. "They are powerful kids," he thought. "They've been through hell, but they're still doing well." The next day, Frank headed to EMC's headquarters to see the benefits department. The department head approached him and, after expressing her sorrow, handed him a package containing Meredith's personal belongings from the office. Frank had to swallow when he noticed the framed family portrait she had on her desk. The director then recommended him to an expert to discuss Meredith's benefits. The first thing he did was investigate Meredith's 401k account. Frank read her annual reports on a regular basis, so he expected no shocks. However, when he saw the sum, it was far greater than he had anticipated. Meredith appears to have boosted her payments to her retirement fund during the last year, above what she was entitled to from the employer. The specialist expressed admiration for her efforts to provide for her family. The specialist also urged Frank to withdraw the monies as soon as possible and roll them into his own IRA so that he could better manage them. Another surprise for Frank was the page that detailed the insurance benefit he would receive as Meredith's beneficiary. He discovered that Meredith had chosen the maximum amount of insurance to which she was entitled, including the accidental death factor. Frank was astounded to learn that he would get Meredith's money for nearly 4 years. The woman added that the insurance company will pay the sum in annual payments. Otherwise, taxes will consume you alive. All rewards were, of course, contingent upon the corporation acquiring a copy of Meredith's death certificate. But after receiving a visit from 2 GBI agents, Frank felt optimistic it would happen shortly. Frank felt relieved as he left the office building. He expected to have to start looking for another work right away. He understood he had a substantial reprieve to get his life in order. "Many thanks, Mary," he whispered vehemently. A few days later, Frank was preparing dinner for his family late one night when the doorbell rang. When Frank went to answer it, he discovered Special Agent Murray at the door. After he allowed her inside, she explained why she was there. "Hi, Mr. Parker. Frank, I wanted to personally let you know that our inquiry is complete and your wife's death certificate has been issued. The court should send you a copy in the mail within the next several days." Frank let out a sigh of relief. He had assumed there would be no complications, but it was comforting to know that this crucial work had been completed. At that moment, a frantic shriek emerged from the back of the home, and Frank was taken aback to hear Laurie's voice. "Daddy, I need your help. Please help me." He rushed inside Laurie's room. Cecilia Marie trailed behind him, reaching for the service handgun in the shoulder holster beneath her jacket. When Frank entered Laurie's room, he noticed his daughter staring at a large crimson bloodstain on her jeans. "I'm bleeding, Daddy," she cried. Frank was terrified. "Laurie, what happened to you? Have you ever cut yourself?" As he moved towards his daughter, someone grabbed his elbow and yanked him back with startling force. "Let me handle this," Celia replied firmly, pushing him towards the door, but he protested. However, the young woman did not back down. "I will handle this, Frank. Simply step out into the living room and wait." Her voice had a dominating quality that made him pause. When the resolute young woman blocked his route, he cautiously retreated into the hallway. Celia quietly closed the door in his face. After 15 nervous minutes, the door opened, and Celia was on the threshold before Frank could inquire. She gripped his arm. "Laurie is doing good. You should go to the store right now and get a pack of sanitary napkins. Select the smallest size." But Laurie, Daniel, began to argue. "I will look after Laurie and inform Daniel of the situation. You, on the other hand, need to go to the store and return here as soon as possible," she remarked, as Frank drove to the closest store. It hit him, and he started to berate himself. "She's menstruating, you moron. You should have noticed it right immediately." On the way back, he kept scolding himself for not talking to his daughter about growing up and becoming a lady. "I need you more than ever, Mary." He felt sorry for himself. When he arrived home, Celia greeted him at the door and grabbed the present from him. "Look at the package." She gave a smile. "You did good, Daddy." Then she vanished into Laurie's room. After another 30 minutes, Celia reappeared, hugging Laurie, who slumped back. As his daughter approached him, Frank sank to his knees and held her. "I am very sorry, honey. I should have told you about this a long time ago. I just didn't think about it. It's all good, Daddy." The girl said something. I simply didn't grasp what was going on. And then I became afraid. Celia told it all to me. Now I know what I need to do. As she spoke, she held Celia's hand, and Frank understood his daughter had found a new friend. He rose up and faced Celia. "Thanks very much. It's a good thing you were here. I must have panicked for a moment." He regarded his daughter. "I'm afraid I'm not very good around girls." Celia smiled, but Daniel appeared from around the corner before she could finish her sentence. "Does the fact that my foolish little sister gets her first period imply we won't eat dinner tonight? I'm hungry." Daniel and Laurie both shrieked, but Frank caught her before she could turn on her older brother, Daniel. Frank cautioned his son, "If you talk to your sister like that again, you will go to bed hungry." But before his warning became too dire, he continued, "Now, wash your hands and arrange the table." He then turned back to Celia. "The least we can do is offer you a lunch in exchange for everything you've done. It's not fine dining, but there is something to eat." The young woman seemed visibly ashamed. "I appreciate it, but I am unable to assist." Laurie tugged on her arm, interrupting her complaints. "Please, Celia, remain and eat with us." Celia smiled at her new friend and said, "All right, Anna, this is just for you." She smiled at Frank again. "Many thanks. I'd love to eat dinner with your family." The four of them sat down at the table, and the two children asked Celia a lot of questions about her law enforcement experiences. Frank, aged 8, listened, pleased by his children's curiosity and delighted by Celia's ease with their queries. He understood that, for the first time in a long time, the two of them appeared to be breaking free from their gloomy shell. After dessert, Frank sent Daniel and Laurie off to do their duties and offered Celia a cup of coffee while they sat at the table. Frank had an opportunity to ask questions. "You seem to get along with Daniel and Laurie. Do you regularly work with young people?" She gave a smile. I am actually from a large family, 3 sisters and 2 brothers. I was the oldest, so I suppose I was like a second mother to the others. She paused for a drink of coffee before continuing. That explains why I knew what to do with Anna this afternoon. I guided each of my sisters through the ordeal of puberty. She smiled at Frank again. In fact, my father was just as powerless as you are now. Frank gave a cheeky grin. All I can say is that I am delighted you landed up here. Even if I had grasped what was going on, I would not have known how to settle Lori down so quickly. She smiled in appreciation, but her demeanor grew more serious. How are they coping with the death of their mother? She inquired. Frank exhaled. I suppose that's about as good as it could get. Anna was quite clinging. I believe she lacks significant feminine influence. Daniel's situation is difficult to predict. He's become grumpy and distant, but I'm not sure if this is due to Mary's death or simply the fact that he's a teenager now. Celia stared at him with sympathy. From what I've seen, I think you're doing an excellent job with him. It will only take time for both them and you. With those comments, she rose up and said, I really enjoyed the meal, Frank, but I have been intruding on your family for far too long. I need to leave now, but if you don't mind, I'd like to say farewell to Anna and Daniel. When Frank nodded, she walked out into the corridor, and he heard her say goodbye to Daniel. She then stayed a few minutes in Anna's room, and when she returned, Anna was walking behind her, her arm around Celia's waist. Frank was surprised to discover she had a new acquaintance. Several days later, Anna received a gift in the mail. When his ecstatic daughter opened the present, she found a pink toy elephant and a note from Celia. Frank was pleased by this concern, but perplexed by the decision. He believed Anna was too old for stuffed animals, but was astonished to see the toy prominently displayed on her bed. I guess she still has a little girl inside her, he said. The next day, he called Celia's office to express his gratitude. I would never have thought of it, he said, but it was exactly what Anna needed. Celia was glad that her daughter was pleased with her present and asked Frank to remain in touch and let her know how Anna and Daniel were doing. Several weeks later, Frank was paying his bills when Daniel's teacher called him one morning. The teacher told Frank, I'd like to meet with you to discuss your son. He has disciplinary issues at school. Frank agreed to meet with her the next day, but chose not to speak to Daniel that night. He preferred to wait till he understood what was going on before confronting his kid. The meeting was set for the following day after school, when the youngsters were in physical education. Mrs. Saldana, the home grade teacher, informed the concerned father that Daniel's behavior in class had deteriorated during the last few months. I didn't want to say anything at first since I knew how much he had gone through. The teacher elaborated, but it appears to be worsening. He is becoming increasingly preoccupied and failing to complete his schoolwork. And the other professors tell me he isn't paying attention in their classrooms. So far, he has always studied well. But if he does nothing to rectify the situation, his grades will plummet dramatically this semester. Frank was worried. Mrs. Saldana, how big of a role does being a teenager play? She told him that it was undoubtedly a challenging age for youngsters, particularly boys. But we are accustomed to it. I believe his mother's death had an impact on him that he is unable to express. Maybe you should visit a psychologist. Frank thanked the woman and went to the car, where he waited nervously for the kids to finish their exercise class. He was upset to hear of Daniel's issues and was determined to have a lengthy conversation with him. When Frank took Daniel and Anna home, he directed Anna to her room to start her homework before leading Daniel into the master bedroom. The boy's expression clouded. He realized he was in trouble. Frank described his encounter with Daniel's home teacher and provided examples she had given him. What is going on, Daniel? Why are you acting this way? Insisted Frank. It's just so, the child replied sulkily. Come on, you're more intelligent than that? His father brushed him off. Don't you value your grades? Not exactly, Daniel mumbled. Frank was irritated by his son's inaction, and he sought to shame him into responding. What would your mother think if she found out you had blown it? Who really cares? Daniel yelled violently in response. She was a slut. Frank grabbed his son and yelled at him out of shock and rage. Don't you ever talk about your mother in that way? How can you say such a thing? The youngster murmured, terrified of his father's rage and the pain of his tight grip. I did see her. I witnessed her doing it with that dude." As soon as the words left his mouth, he dropped on the bed and began to sob in surprise. Frank sat on the bed next to his son. He wrapped his arms around him and cradled him like a young infant. "It's fine," he said, attempting to alleviate the boy's obvious worry. When Daniel's crying stopped, Frank raised his son's head. "It is all fine, Daniel. I'm not angry at you. Just let me know what you saw." His son was in tears as he gazed at him. "It was last fall. You let me ride my bike to school one time. But I forgot my math homework, so I slipped home during lunch and took it while hunting for it in my room. I heard my mother walk in. I hid so she wouldn't catch me. That's when I noticed a man's voice. 'What's up, man?' I asked Frank a little too soon. I honestly don't know. Someone mentioned Daniel. I haven't seen him before." "It's all right," Frank assured him. "Please tell me what happens next." "They came in here and it got quiet, so I thought I could sneak out. But then I heard my mother make a strange noise and I became afraid. When I looked into the room, they were lying on the bed. The words came out of his mouth faster and faster, as if he was trying to spit them out. When he was finished, he burst into tears again. "Why did she do that, Daddy? How could Mom be such a slut?" Hearing his son's story, Frank felt himself going numb, but he didn't have time to deal with his feelings. His son depended on him. "I completely understand, Daniel. It's fine. I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm glad you told me." He gently took his son by the shoulders and turned him around to face him. "Sometimes people we care about make mistakes or do things we dislike. It does not imply that we no longer love them, rather we dislike what they did. I have no idea why your mother did what she did, son. But I know she loved you and Lori very much. I want you to remember only good things about her." He hugged his son and continued to talk to him for a while longer when he felt the boy had calmed down enough. He gently asked him to get started on his homework, and Frank went to the kitchen to make dinner before Daniel left. Frank asked him not to say anything to Lori. The boy promised, and Frank was sure he would keep the disturbing news from his sister. The rest of the evening passed without incident. But as soon as the children went to bed, Frank began to vent his emotions. His first reaction was to deny what Daniel had told him. His son must have been mistaken or misinterpreted what he had seen, but he couldn't maintain that logic for long. His son was overly upset by what had transpired. Frank's thoughts were harsh following this confession. How could Mary have betrayed him? He believed they had a good marriage. How could she possibly have had pleasure with someone on the side? Anyway, who was that man, and how long did the affair last? It's difficult to lose your wife in a plane catastrophe, he thought in despair. It's more terrible to discover you lost her long before that. Sleep did not come that night. The next day, Frank was in a dark mood. It was Tuesday when he typically went to the gym, and after the kids went to school, he resolved to keep up his fitness routine for a bit. The exercise served to divert him, but once he sat on the treadmill, his thoughts reverted to his wife's infidelity. How could Mary do that? And in our own beds, he asked. The location made the treachery all the more horrifying. And how did she know I wouldn't be home? But the answer was immediate. It must have been one of those days when I visited the gym. She was confident that the house would be empty because I am a creature of habit. However, the answer to one question soon created others. If she arranged her brief meeting to fit into my schedule, it didn't happen unexpectedly. How frequently did she meet with him? She could not have seen him every week. Her travel schedule may have gotten in the way. Each question appeared to worsen his situation. He tried to act normal in front of Daniel and Lori, but he continued to suffer for the following 3 days. He decided to visit the drugstore to purchase antacids. He had never experienced stomach troubles before. His sadness was heightened by the fact that he had no one to tell about his discoveries. He definitely did not want to inform his parents or Meredith. He knew the news would be upsetting for them. Similarly, he did not want to talk to his pals for fear of being the subject of local gossip, and he reasoned that he did not want any of his peers to tease Daniel or Lori. He felt entrapped. He was working at his desk one evening when he came across Celia Marie's business card. He remembered that she had told him to call her if he had any additional information, but in reality, he was yearning for an excuse to tell someone about his news. Another point of view. He dialed the cell phone number she had written on the card, and when he identified himself, Celia appeared glad to hear from him. Her tone turned to concern when he indicated he needed to speak with her. "Are Anna and Daniel okay?" she inquired eagerly. He said, "They do, but I don't. Would you mind having lunch with me tomorrow?" "It is not something I want to discuss over the phone." She readily agreed and recommended a location near the GBI office where she worked. "It's a tranquil area. We can talk," she said him as he hung up the phone. Frank felt a little comforted by the possibility of conversing. Celia was waiting in the restaurant when Frank walked through the doorway. She smiled in greeting, but it quickly faded as she noticed the distressed expression on his face. She couldn't take it anymore as they sat down at the table and placed their orders. "Frank, what's wrong?" "You requested me to let you know if I had any additional information regarding my wife," he explained. "I'm not sure whether this has anything to do with your investigation, but I recently discovered that Meredith has been cheating on me." As he spoke, he was mortified, and tears flowed down his face. Celia rushed across the table to take his hands. "Frankly, this is bad. Tell me what occurred." The full narrative of Daniel's interaction with his teacher, the battle with his son, and Daniel's terrible confession erupted, interrupted only by the presence of food. Celia listened silently, allowing him to narrate at his own pace. She didn't say anything until he finished. "Poor Daniel," she said. "It's no surprise that he behaves this way at school. It must have been festering in him since everything happened. And then she died. No wonder he was concerned." She had left go of Frank's hands when the waitress brought their order, but was now leaning across the table to grab for him again. "It's difficult for me to understand what this has done to you, Frank." She spoke quietly, and Frank saw sympathy in her eyes. "Were there any indications that something was wrong, Frank? Did you spot any clues when you looked back?" she asked. "No," he responded. "I cannot say I saw anything. You know what they say, the husband is always the last to know." He took a moment to look down at his untouched plate before returning his focus to the woman. "Our sex life has taken a sharp decline after she received her major promotion. But given the demands of her new position and travel schedule, I believed it was understandable. I didn't like it, but I felt compelled to put up with it for the sake of our family. She kept telling me that things will improve once she moved to the national level, but he paused. That didn't seem destined to happen." Then he frowned. "It is killing me that I don't have any answers. I'm not sure what kind of bastard she was sleeping with. I'm not sure when their affair began or how long it lasted. I'm not sure if she was in love with this person or if she planned to leave me. Worst of all, I'm not sure why she did this to me or the kids." Celia squeezed his hands. "Frank, please listen to me. The truth is that you are unlikely to ever receive answers to your queries. You'll have to forget about all of this. With her death, nothing matters now. All you can do is focus on your family and yourself." "I know you're right," he replied. "However, being betrayed in this manner is really painful. I guess she stopped loving me." "No," answered Celia vehemently. "You were wrong, regardless of what transpired. Meredith clearly still cared about you and the kids. Check out what you learned at EMC. She purchased maximum life insurance to ensure that you were all covered. She contributed the maximum amount to her 401. Kay intends to set aside money for your future. I'm not sure what else has transpired in her life, but everything appears like care to me. Thanks, Celia. I'll try to remember that when they stand up to depart." He looked at the table. Neither of them had touched their supper. "I guess I'm not a good lunch option," he replied wryly. "Don't worry about it," she said carelessly. "Skipping a meal or two is certainly beneficial for me." Frank examined her slim form. "She seems excellent to me," he thought. As they walked out the door, he reflected on how long it had been. She took his hand. "Please remain in touch, Frank, and let me know if there is anything I can do to assist. I truly want to assist." Then she reached out to kiss his cheek as she turned away. Frank thought she blushed. Frank was surprised to see that his mood had improved once he returned home. "I guess I needed to talk it out," he told himself. The following Saturday, Frank was in the yard, collecting limbs that had fallen during a thunderstorm. When he entered the house, he noticed Anna conversing on the phone. He turned to face Daniel, who was standing nearby. "Did anyone call?" asked Frank. "No," Daniel said dismissively. "She's merely talking with her new best friend, Celia." Frank was astonished. Does she make a lot of calls to Celia? And what about the beef? Dad. Daniel reacted with sorrow. You're completely off the mark. BFF means best buddy forever. Anna looked up to see her father. If Daddy is available, we will take Celia out to dinner. Let me talk to her, he replied, extending his hand to his daughter as she handed him the phone. He said, hello, Celia. I believe you overheard that. Do you want to have supper with Anna tonight? Daniel and I will be here as well. He heard her pleasant giggle, followed by a swift agreement. Very well, he replied. Why don't you come here around 6 o'clock? After they'd agreed. Frank hung up the phone and turned to his daughter. Well, here she comes, he remarked. I hope you're happy. Yes, Daddy, she squealed. In that case, you and Daniel should tidy up the place so she doesn't think we're living like pigs. Daddy, do I have to? Daniel complained. But before Frank could respond, the child turned and started gathering up the clothes he had left in the room. He's still an adolescent, Frank reasoned, but he seems to be improving. Frank turned to head for the kitchen and began to consider what cuisine he should prepare. He reasoned that there must be something greater than spaghetti and meatballs. He ultimately decided on the fish dish, which he considered one of his specialties, after recalling the first time Celia dined with him. He was confident he could do it, and the kids enjoyed it, which was always a positive. He was aware that he would need to go to the grocery store for this. After describing his mission to Daniel and Lori, he told them to stay inside the house until he returned. He got a lovely piece of fish in the seafood area before heading to the bakery for some dessert. I should get a good bottle of wine. He considered his options before directing his trolley to the suitable aisle. Once he had discovered what he was looking for, he went to the store's floral section and purchased a bouquet for the table. On the way home, he considered what he was doing. I'm actually binging on this food, he realized with surprise. He eventually felt that he owed Celia a decent meal. After all, I wrecked her meal, he told himself. Celia answered the doorbell at 6 p.m., and before Frank could answer, Anna was already welcoming her in, much to his surprise. Even Daniel showed in, and the teenager struck up a pleasant discussion. Frank felt awkward and inarticulate. Celia, on the other hand, made no indication that she observed it. Instead, she chatted cheerfully with Anna and eagerly accompanied her to see what the girl had to show Celia in her room. By the time they returned, dinner was practically ready. The meal was a huge success. Celia was highly impressed with his cooking abilities. A man who knows how to cook. Mother had told me about people like you, she taunted, as well as the fact that he seemed at ease with the kids, both of whom chattered away in response to her questions. When dessert was over, she insisted on participating in the cleanup, and with her assistance, the dishes were quickly stored, cleaned, and placed in the dishwasher to run later. At this point, Daniel excused himself to continue playing video games. He had paused, and Anna wanted to watch a favorite program that she had recorded, so the two grown-ups poured their glasses with wine and went out into the living room. Frank, it was fantastic. Celia complimented him. I'm not sure when I've had so much fun. Thank you so much for inviting me. I doubt Anna would ever talk to me again if I didn't. Frank laughed. Celia joined him. She's a beautiful girl. And you're lucky to have her, she said. Her father is also doing a really decent job. Frank's face flushed. But then Celia's face became more serious. Frank, aside from having a nice time with you, I'm delighted you invited me because I have some information I'd want to share. Frank noticed the altered inflection in her voice and stared at her with curiosity. This is extremely confidential, Frank, but I believe I know you well enough to trust you. And it affects you, at least indirectly. She had obviously captured his attention. As you are aware, Celia, the GBI was meant to perform a regular investigation before issuing your wife's death certificate. And as you know, we found no cause to reject to issue a duly issued certificate. She took a big breath before continuing. Naturally, we did the same with John Collier, but we discovered a few anomalies. First, it became clear that he was in financial problems as a result of a series of poor investment decisions. Frank nodded. What Celia stated mirrored what Amanda Collier told him. Furthermore, Celia has stated several times in recent weeks that she is SI. Security has notified us that they have identified what appear to be substantial abnormalities in the Southeastern Accounting Department, led by John Collier. Even more concerning, they believe they have discovered a fraudulent billing technique that may have resulted in the theft of millions of dollars from EMC, and John Collier appears to have approved it. Amanda Frank said that she did not deserve that. But when he considered what Celia had told him, more options emerged. Could John Collier have played a role in the disaster? He asked. Could that have been an attempt to disguise his tracks? When Celia said nothing, Frank's imagination went into overdrive. What if Meredith found out about the Collier scheme? What if he killed her to silence her and used the plane disaster to conceal evidence? Maybe he is still alive. Perhaps he is hiding off in a villa by the sea, laughing at all of us. Take your time, Frank, Celia urged. You're getting carried away. The most likely scenario is that the jet went down unexpectedly, as we had assumed all along. If Collier was truly involved in the embezzlement conspiracy, the crash derailed his ambitions. We will investigate all possibilities. However, we cannot jump to conclusions, and neither should you. But Frank had a difficult time turning off his imagination. You don't think Meredith was involved, do you? He asked aggressively. Celia sighed. It is not out of the question. She agreed, but we don't believe it is likely. For starters, if she was involved, it would imply that she had made a deliberate decision to abandon her family. It's unusual for a mother to abandon her children, especially those their age, she remarked, gesturing toward the children's chambers. Collier, on the other hand, had no children, and his wife claimed that their marriage was on the edge of dissolution at the time of his disappearance. Furthermore, unlike Collier, Meredith's funds were in perfect order, and she had made no indication that she was involved in any scheme previous to her disappearance, if there were one. In reality, her actions were diametrically opposed to those of someone who intended to disappear. But this is all just supposition. The only fact we have, Celia continued, is that Meredith's jet crashed into the sea. She hoped to reassure Frank. But as she looked at the man, she noticed he was still unhappy at her revelations. Frank, you have to promise me that you will not talk about any of this. It's highly confidential, and if that gets out, it may compromise our investigation. It might possibly lead to my dismissal. This made Frank tense. He recognized Celia had taken a risk by confiding in him, and he had to remain silent. I understand, Celia, and I will not jeopardize your inquiry, but I need to inquire. Why did you tell me all of this? She gazed at him. Seriously, it is doubtful, Frank, but there's always the possibility that you'll hear or learn anything that can assist us. Put some light on the situation. If you do, Frank, vow to get back to me immediately away. No, please, Lone Rangers. He met her gaze. I promise you, Celia. Then he smiled. Furthermore, if I have to deal with you again, it won't be such a chore. The smile she offered him seemed to brighten the whole room. Celia was soon forced to leave. Before leaving, she said her goodbyes to Bobby and Anna. Frank noticed that Daniel had halted his game to wish her goodbye, which was a genuine compliment from him. Anna led her buddy to the door again, stealing Celia's vow to phone her. This time, however, Anna hugged her. As she walked to her car, Celia made sure to lean against the door and kiss Frank on the cheek. Anna looked to her father and stated, "She likes you, Dad." Frank smiled at his daughter and pulled her closer to him. Well, I like her too. After everyone had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Frank laid in his bed, reflecting on what Celia had told him and the various situations he had imagined. Mary, he was thinking, what did you get yourself into? He finally drifted into an uneasy slumber. A week later, Frank sat at his computer and saw something strange. He was reading about his favorite sports teams, and as he was about to click on the Falcons tab, he spotted a Facebook icon directly above it. He clicked on it impulsively. Frank was not a Facebook user. In fact, he hardly used the site at all. The only reason he had an account was to keep track of his kids. Daniel and Anna enjoyed the social networking site and utilized it to remain in touch with their pals. Frank didn't mind at first, but after reading a few alarming articles about some of the problems, he created his own account and insisted that Daniel and Anna add them as friends. He also asked them for the passwords to their pages. That way, he reasoned, I'd be able to see all of the messages and photographs they shared, as well as anything their friend sent them. More significantly, he hoped Daniel and Anna would understand that he could spy on them, which would urge them to be discreet. When he signed on to his page, the majority of what he saw bore him, but he did see a friend request from someone he had never heard of, Tom Thompson. The name appeared unknown to him, and there was no photo, only a silhouette. When Frank clicked on the name, The strangers page just advised him that personal information was only available to friends. "Hello, Daniel," he called out. "Do we know someone named Tom Thompson?" His son stepped into the room and noticed his father perusing Facebook. "That dude. Simply ignore him, Dad. He's been convincing me to add him as a friend for weeks now. I just deleted his requests." At that point, did Anna enter the room? "Yeah, he also tried to get me to friend him. He's just a creep on Facebook." It was enough to catch Frank's attention. Some unknown person wanted to contact both him and his children. Frank was aware that there were numerous scammers and far scarier predators out there. He was alarmed, but didn't want to terrify the kids. So he merely stated, "You both did the right thing." He reassured them that they should never respond online to strangers. Well, as he looked for a means to defend his family, an unexpected thought occurred to him. Perhaps Celia can help us figure out who this creepy Thomason is. He called her home, and she must have recognized his name from the caller ID since she responded cheerfully. "Hello, Frank." "Hello, Celia. I am delighted I caught you. Is there any chance you could come over? Something unusual has come up, and I'd like to see if you're available. It's nothing serious, right? Daniel and Anna are fine, right?" Frank couldn't help but observe that she appeared to be just as concerned about his children as he was. It gave him a nice feeling. She informed him she was working in the yard but could drive up in 45 minutes. To Frank. Surprisingly, her automobile arrived at the curb practically simultaneously with Mary's. He remembered that he was lucky if she was only an hour late while striving to improve her image. But Celia arrived on schedule and evidently freshly washed, dressed in a casual yet appealing attire with nicely done hair and fresh makeup. Even in such a short period of time, she had clearly put in an effort. "You look nice, Celia. You didn't need to dress up for us," he explained. She squeezed his hand. "Thanks, Frank. I wanted it so desperately." When she arrived home, Frank summoned his children, who entered the room noisily. He requested them to inform Celia about their possible Facebook friend Daniel, and as the family's official expert, he used the chance to brag, quickly getting into each of the family's 3 Facebook accounts and receiving friend invitations from the mysterious Tom Thomas Thompson, who praised Daniel's talent. Celia sat in front of the screen and searched through all of the unread and archived messages, but she couldn't uncover any more information. She finally looked up at Daniel and Anna. The most likely explanation is some form of marketing trick. If you accepted the request, you'd undoubtedly get a slew of advertising for stuff you don't need or offers to buy fictitious gold from Nigeria. There are terrible individuals in this world, and you should never tell strangers about yourself. Okay. Both children nodded seriously, and Frank realized that the message he had received from Celia had probably had a greater impact on them than when he had delivered it while they were working on their computers. It was growing dark outside, and Frank knew his children would be hungry soon. Celia is probably going out to dinner soon. It won't be fancy, simply a family eatery. However, as Frank had expected, we would appreciate it if you could join us. Anna and Daniel both insisted on her joining them right away. She laughed and accepted the inevitable. The 4 of them jumped into Frank's vehicle and drove to a convenient location near their house. As they traveled, Celia started asking the kids about what she had seen on their Facebook accounts. Anna and Daniel quickly began conversing excitedly about their friends and activities. Frank listened to the exchange and pondered. Celia undoubtedly knows more about Anna and Daniel's lives than Mary did. He remembered the few times they had gone out together before she died. Meredith's interactions had primarily focused on her career. He felt horrible about his infidelity, but knew it was real. The spirited conversation continued through dinner and the trip home, and Frank was overjoyed when Celia entered the house with them. The children instantly sat in front of the television and invited Celia to join them, but she dismissed them. "I need to talk to your dad for a while." She took his hand and brought him to the living room. After they sat down, her expression went serious, and she continued, "I don't want to alarm Daniel and Anna, but I don't think those Facebook requests were a marketing ploy. The Bureau has received alerts about some identity theft scams, but they typically do not target children. Someone appears to be attempting to obtain information about your family on purpose." Frank's blood ran cold at the notion of his children being in danger. Who might it be? What might they want? She said, "I don't know, Frank. This is unlike any other cyber fraud model I have encountered. What can we do? Close their Facebook accounts. Perhaps keep kids off the internet altogether. She seems thoughtful. I don't believe it's necessary, provided they avoid communicating with strangers. And if they receive gibberish emails with embedded websites, remind them not to click on the links. She paused for a few moments before speaking. The internet's problem is its unstructured nature. You don't know who you're working with or where they are, but it's not as opaque as many people believe. I know someone in the federal government who might be able to help us. He will most likely be unable to determine Tom Thomason's identity, but he may be able to tell us where he lives. Let me call you on Monday and tell you what I find out about those words. When she returned, she got up and went to her room to say goodnight to her 2 children. Frank led her to the door, but before she opened it, he embraced her. "You've been like a guardian angel for us," he replied truly. "I'm not sure what we would have done without you." She peered into his eyes for a second before kissing him quickly on the lips. "I'm not sure if I want to be an angel," she admitted with a wink. "They do not have much fun." She immediately turned and hurried rapidly to her car, leaving Frank confused. Celia stuck to her word and called Frank late Monday morning. "Do you know someone from Palm Beach, Florida?" she asked. Frank said, "Not a soul. Whoever Tom Thomason is, he made his Facebook account using a zip code that begins with 334, so he is someplace in Palm Beach County," she said. "I can't comprehend why someone in Palm Beach would try to contact us," Frank explained, "but at least he isn't around. That is reassuring." "I agree," Celia stated. "Besides, we've been tracking a lot of scammers in South Florida, so maybe this is a new type of internet scam. Just make sure Daniel and Anna have nothing to do with the friend requests." "I will, Celia. Thank you. I feel so much better about the whole situation. I'm pleased I could assist Frank," regardless of what he had said to Celia. Frank was not reassured. On the contrary, it appeared to him that he and his children were under constant attack. First came the devastating news of Meredith's death. Then, poor Daniel admitted that his wife had cheated on him. Then he learned that Mary may have been involved in some dishonest business operations before her death. And now, an unknown someone was attempting to obtain information about his children. Frank felt as if they were under siege, so he resolved to strike back. His first goal was to track down the opponent in Palm Beach County and face him. But how could he accomplish that? A quick internet search revealed that the county had a population of 1.3 million. Seeking for Tom Thompson is like seeking for a short stick in tall grass. Besides, Frank thought it was just as probable that the name was a fabrication. Frank's orderly intellect continued to beat over the problem. Then, an idea hit him. If I can't find Thomas, maybe he'll find me. A plan began to emerge in his head. The possibilities are slim, he acknowledged. But this is all I have. The first thing he needed to do was remove Daniel and Anna from the situation. It was almost time for summer vacation, which gave Frank an idea. He dialed his in-laws' telephone. "Dad, would you and Mom like Daniel and Anna to come see us for a week? I will need to leave town during that time, so you'd be a great help." When the children's grandfather joyfully consented, all difficulties about their stay were settled. Frank hung up the phone and promptly contacted Delta. "I want to book a flight to Palm Beach." His children were overjoyed to learn of their upcoming visit with their grandparents. Their enthusiasm dimmed when they discovered that their father would not be with them. This would be their first separation since their mother's death. And the thought rekindled the anxiety of abandonment they had experienced since then. Frank hated causing the children any distress, but he felt compelled to carry out his plan, and he was successful in convincing them. Frank started having misgivings around a week before their visit. "Am I doing the correct thing?" he questioned himself. Despite the uncertainty, the idea of doing nothing was worse. His inner anguish was briefly interrupted by a phone call from Celia, who wanted to know how he and his family were doing. After a few minutes of talking, the tone of her voice altered somewhat, and Frank noticed she sounded almost shy. "I was wondering if you would like to meet together next week. I haven't seen you or the kids in a while," and her voice trailed off uncertainly. "I would love to do that, Celia, but then I'll take the kids to their grandparents. We will be gone all week," she said. "I understand. Maybe another time." "That would be extremely nice, Celia." He spoke earnestly. Frank felt horrible for lying to Celia about his goals, but he convinced himself it was at least somewhat genuine. Furthermore, he was confident he knew what she would say if he confessed his genuine intentions. When Frank got home and took the children to see his relatives in the village, he sat down at the family computer. One of the reasons he asked Meredith's family to take his children was because he knew they didn't have a computer, so he felt comfortable entering onto Lori's Facebook. Sure enough, Tom Thompson sent me a friendship request. Frank hit the accept button and shortly received confirmation that Anna had become friends with the stranger. If nothing comes of this, Frank reasoned, I'll simply unsubscribe from him later. Next came the most difficult part, appearing to be a 12-year-old girl. He reviewed his daughter's prior texts and concluded that he could emulate her style fairly effectively. I might not be able to fool her friends, he thought to himself, but I hope I can fool Tom Thompson. He decided that his first communication should build the groundwork and sent a brief letter about his visit to the country. Frank assumed Anna had a little news for her friends, nothing to raise the suspicions of the lurkers. The next day, he intended to set a trap. OMG, I am heading to Florida. My best friend Celia offered to take me with her and my father consented. Are you planning to fly off tomorrow? Cannot wait. Frank chose to address Celia by her first name because it appeared that neither Lori's friends nor Tom Thompson knew her. He hoped Celia didn't mind that the bait was in the water. Frank wanted to wiggle it enough to attract the fish's attention. I cannot believe I am in Palm Beach. That is to die for. In the evening, Frank published the following piece. We spent the day at the beach. Frank put a note. I'm going to be so tan the next morning, hoping it would catch on. I'm heading back to the beach tonight. Tomorrow, Celia will take me shopping on 4th Avenue. We will eat lunch at Taboo's. Kukui'ula. As soon as the entry appeared on Anna's page, Frank drove to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Soon. He had already settled into his seat for the 2-hour journey to Palm Beach. Looking out the window, he remembered having been to Palm Beach once before. In fact, he and Mary had passed through town on their way home from their honeymoon in Miami Beach. They had driven across the Lake Worth Bridge and then down Southern Ocean Boulevard, admiring the mansions that overlooked the Atlantic. After landing, Frank rented a car and drove to the motel in West Palm Beach where he had booked a room. He went across the street to a fast food restaurant and got a sandwich and a Coke, which he ate in his room while studying a city map on his computer. He hoped he was doing the correct thing. After breakfast, he checked Lori's Facebook page but found only a few envious replies from her classmates. He didn't expect Thomas to contact him, but he hoped his fishing expedition might find something. Around 10 a.m., he got in his car and drove east over the Royal Park Bridge, turned south and then east again to Worth Avenue. He wanted to be there early and he needed to park the car on the street so he could get there quickly if necessary. After driving around the block where the restaurant was several times, he was beginning to wonder if he had miscalculated. But suddenly a car pulled out in front of him and he was able to pull into the parking space. Setting the meter down, he walked down the street in front of the restaurant, noticing a bench in the shade. He gratefully took a seat on it. He grabbed his baseball cap and sunglasses and put them on, hoping to disguise himself. Then he pulled out a copy of the Palm Beach Post and pretended to read while looking around the street. As he sat there, the realization of how flimsy his plan was slowly began to set in. He had no idea if the mysterious Tom Thompson had seen the fake posts on Lori's Facebook page and would show up in response. Worse, Frank had no idea who he was looking for unless the mystery man turned out to be John Collier, which Frank thought was unlikely. How would he be able to recognize the threat? All he could hope for was to spot the suspicious man, whatever that meant, and come face to face with him. The street was crowded and Frank kept trying to keep track of all the passers-by. The restaurant was starting to fill up and his stomach rumbled as he watched the people coming in. He cursed himself for not thinking to bring a sandwich, but he didn't dare leave his post. Time stretched slowly as he sat there, and after a while he saw the crowd in the restaurant begin to thin. Glancing at his watch, he realized it was over an hour later. What an idiot, he thought. I wouldn't be any worse off if I stayed home, and at least I could see Celia again. While he was looking at the shoppers passing by, a woman strolling across the street caught his eye. Here I go again, Frank thought, seeing Mary in a crowd of strangers. In fact, he noted, the woman looked nothing like Meredith at all. Meredith had shoulder-length brunette hair, and this woman was a blonde with a short haircut, and her clothes were different from anything Frank had ever seen Meredith wear. But there was something eerily familiar about her, and as he continued to watch her, Frank realized that it was her gait that had triggered his reaction. He impulsively got up and followed her, glancing down the street. He saw that the blonde had reached the corner and was trying to hail a cab, risking his life. Frank ran across Worth Avenue and jumped into the car just as he pulled away from He saw the woman climb into the back seat of the cab and raced down the avenue toward the Atlantic before reaching Southern Ocean Boulevard. The cab turned left onto County Road and headed north. Frank followed it for some distance. Finally, he saw that the cab turned left onto a suburban street and kept going until it got almost to Lake Worth. Frank stopped the car at the curb about a soccer field away and watched as the woman paid the driver and then entered an elegant house that faced the lake. Frank squinted his eyes, trying to get a good look at her with her hair color and short cut. She looked nothing like Mary, but she was the same height and weight, and as she walked down the path toward the house, Frank was again amazed at her gait sitting in the car. Frank suddenly remembered a book he had read a long time ago. In the story, an actor needed a disguise, but instead of a false mustache or wig, he just put pebbles in his shoes. If someone sees me, the actor told his friend, they'll say, "Looks like that guy." But it's not him because I'll walk differently. It works the other way too, thought Frank, as he recalled the book. The certainty grew in him that he had just seen his deceased wife trying to hold back his growing anger. He ran down the street and walked to the door. He rang the doorbell and crossed his arms and waited. Opening the door, the woman looked at him with a perplexed look. Then she did a double take and shrieked, "Frank, what are you doing here?" "Hello, Mary. Funny to meet you here," he said sarcastically. After a moment's hesitation, she spread her arms to hug him, but he quickly raised his hands to stop her. "Don't touch me," he growled. Then, unable to contain his anger any longer, he shouted, "How could you do this to me? How could you leave Daniel and Anna throwing an anxious glance outside?" Meredith grabbed his arm and dragged him into the house, slamming the door behind her. "I did it all for you, baby, for you and the kids," she urged. "You have to believe me. It was the only way out." As she spoke. Every now and then, she looked around nervously. "What the hell are you talking about?" demanded Frank hotly. "You're missing the point. None of this makes any sense." "Sit down, little one," she coaxed him. "You have to let me explain everything." She was still speaking loudly and rubbed her hands together nervously, sitting down and urging him on. When Frank sat down, an icy calm descended upon him. "Okay, Mary, I'm listening. I was so close to it, baby. I had a coveted big job in my pocket. But then the damn economy went down. I knew if I could get a little more bang for the buck in the region, the economy would recover and the promotion would be secured." She smiled pleadingly and held out her palms to her husband and Frank. "Once I got this job, we'd be on Easy Street. No worries about paying for college for the kids, no worries about retirement, no worries ever again." Frank could barely contain himself. Was it all about money and Mary's position in the company? Meredith's hands rested on her lap again. "So John and I," John Collier said Frank grimly. "Yes," she continued, not catching his mood. "You've met him? Anyway, he and I figured out a way to move a few sales from our biggest accounts. We knew they'd show up eventually. We booked them earlier in the current quarter. Every other region was reporting a significant decrease in sales, and we had a significant increase. The corporation was just thrilled. We earned the biggest bonuses the company has ever paid," she says proudly. Then the smile slid off her face like a cloth falling to the floor. But the economy was getting worse, not better. And when John told me it would all come out eventually, I knew we had to do something about it. We knew we'd need a lot of money to pull this thing off. So John created a dummy vendor account and started sending fake invoices to EMC. They're so sloppy and wasteful over there, they didn't even notice. "So you were planning to fake your death in a plane crash to cover your tracks?" asked Frank. "That's right, kid," she said, as if Frank was her star pupil. "With enough money, it's not hard to get someone to leave a Zodiac motorboat with a GPS signal in the Caribbean. We just homed in on the signal and landed right next to it. So this whole thing was just a way to steal a lot of money and abandon the family? Asked John bitterly. No, she protested, that's not it at all. I knew I'd have to get out of sight for a while, but I made sure you and the kids were okay. I took out life insurance and put everything I could into my 401. Okay, so you guys would have plenty of money? She said proudly. And you thought having enough money would make up for the loss of my wife and the mother of our children. This time she heard his bitterness. No, baby, no, you don't understand. I was going to come back for you as soon as things settled down, was going to contact you. We could go somewhere safe, baby. We could be together. As she spoke, her eyes continued to dart around the room, Frank at her with a stony stare. You're only missing one thing, he said in an even voice. What is it, baby? She asked. You forgot about having fun with John Collier, he said. She was scared at first, but then she stood up and held out her arms to him. No, baby, it wasn't like that. John and I just worked together. We were never more than co-workers. Don't lie to me, Meredith, Frank snapped back. Daniel, you two together in our bedroom? She sighed. God, did Daniel see us? That's awful. A sob caught in her throat, but then she came to her senses and straightened up again. It was just one time, baby. He said he wouldn't help me unless I gave myself to him. But it was just one time, I swear. Frank stood up, ignoring her. He looked around. Come out, John, he said loudly. I know you're out here somewhere. Meredith continued to wail. No, baby, it's just me. It was just one time. But no sooner had she continued than John Collier appeared from the bedroom. He was wearing a robe and had his hands in his pockets. Lay off, Mary. He knows, Collier muttered, though he guessed. They live together here. Collier used his wife's favorite name, made Frank wince. Meredith began to cry. He must have found us through Facebook, Collier grumbled. I warned you, but you just had to check your two offspring. Then his tone changed to cold and hard. But that doesn't matter now. We need to get out of here. He turned to Frank and pulled an automatic rifle from his robe pocket, which he pointed in Frank's direction. As for you, bright boy, you're the only one who knows we're still alive. No, John, no, screamed Meredith, but Collier ignored her. Looks like your kids are going to lose not only their daddy, but their mommy too, he said with a chuckle, raising his gun at Frank. I wouldn't do that if I were you, came a voice from the hallway. All three turned around in amazement and saw the figure of Celia Murray appear in front of them, holding a Smith & Wesson automatic at Collier's throat. Before Collier could react, a second voice came from behind him. Drop the gun, Collier. It is over. Special Agent Harold Barnes emerged from the kitchen, his gun also pointed at Collier. The former head of the accounting department looked at the two agents hostilely, but then his shoulders slumped. He dropped the gun to the carpet and slowly raised his hands while Barnes held the gun at gunpoint. Celia quickly went behind the sullen man and twisted one of his arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs around his wrist. She then slid the other arm down and snapped the second handcuff. After securing Collier, she repeated the procedure with Meredith as the two lay on the floor. Barnes made a cell phone call to the Palm Beach Police Department. A second call went to the local FBI office. A short time later, the house was crowded with uniformed and plainclothes officers. Frank just stood back, looking dumbfounded at what was happening as the fugitives were led away. Frank scrutinized them both. Collier was muttering to himself. Meredith was crying. Neither looked in Frank's direction. When they left, Celia walked over to Barnes, hugged him, and kissed him on the cheek. Thank you for coming with me, partner. I owe you a great debt of gratitude. The senior agent smiled. No, you don't owe me anything. Solving this case will reflect very well in our personal affairs. When Barnes left, Celia finally looked at Frank. To his amazement, she walked over to him, put her arms, his neck, and sobbed. You big idiot. Don't you ever do that to me again. You could have killed yourself. He held her tightly until her crying subsided. Then he pulled her away from him enough that he could look into her face. What are you doing here? He asked. How did you know where to find me? She smiled through her tears. Anna called me to chat. When she told me you weren't with them at their grandparents' house, I suspected you were going to do something stupid and started making inquiries. When I saw her Facebook posts, I called the airline and found out that you had booked a flight to Palm Beach. I talked Harold into coming with me, and we've been following you since first thing in the morning." She shook her head. "We almost lost you when you took off after that cab, but Harold guessed which way you turned and was right." Frank pulled her even tighter against him. "I guess you really are my guardian angel," he said, and kissed her. 2 years later, Frank pulled the collar of his coat tighter, his neck. The humidity was high, as always, and the wind off Puget Sound was cold and damp. Still, Frank thought, it feels good to be here. The last 2 years had been difficult in many ways. If it was a terrible shock for Frank to discover that his wife was alive, the consequences were even worse for Anna. The fact that she went to trial and was convicted of numerous criminal charges only added to the family's pain. During the inevitable media hype surrounding the arrest and trial, Frank feared his children would not make it through. The divorce was a mere formality. Legally, Meredith could no longer be dead, but she would spend the next 12 years of her life in Arundel State Prison. The International Marketing Corps, of course, demanded that Frank return not only Meredith's life insurance policy, but also most of her 401k since it was funded by bonuses she hadn't earned as the innocent party. Frank may have had reason to keep some of the funds, but he wanted nothing to do with any part of his ex-wife's money. Instead, he began urgently looking for work as his family's savings were nearly depleted. The offer he received from a large aerospace company was coveted not only because it would provide for his family, but also because it meant moving across the country. There were too many reminders of Meredith in Atlanta and too many questions from friends and others that he and his children couldn't answer. Finding a new place to live and work seemed like the best solution for all of them. Frank didn't want to leave the state where he and his children were born, but he was ready to embrace the Pacific Northwest and start a new life. They were lucky enough to sell the house in Atlanta and were able to buy a nice, albeit slightly smaller house in Seattle. Meredith had always wanted to live in a luxurious house, and Frank was happy with something more cozy. The kids seemed to like it too, and they were already making friends at the new school. He walked in from the deck and looked around for his car keys. Finding them, he poked his head into the kitchen to look for his wife. "Come on, Angel, let's go get our kids." Celia smiled happily at him. "Thank you for spending the time to hear today's story. If you enjoyed this essay, please like it and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a tale to share regarding your or someone else's circumstance, please do not hesitate to contact me. Take care.